Hunger was a constant companion in medieval Europe. Between the 5th and 15th centuries, a time marked by war, pestilence, and agricultural limitation, food insecurity shaped the rhythms of daily life. The average peasant household depended on subsistence farming, with little room for failure. Crops failed due to droughts, floods, or disease, and livestock were often too precious to slaughter. In this reality, survival often demanded choices that would be unthinkable today. During crises, such as the Great Famine of 1st Re. 151317, communities throughout Europe were pushed to the brink. Contemporary chronicles describe desperate scenes, bodies left in the streets, outbreaks of cannibalism, and the systemic hunting of non-traditional food sources. In Paris, Jean de Venay recorded that the poor would scour alleys, setting traps and striking down any feline they could find. It was not an act of cruelty, but of survival. Feudal structures exacerbated this desperation. Much of what peasants grew was claimed as tax or tithe, leaving them with meager rations. In good years, these were enough. In bad ones, they were not. The social elite might have reserves, salted meats, and trade connections. The poor had instinct, ingenuity, and whatever lived within reach. The church, a dominant cultural force, exerted strong influence over diets through religious fasts and food taboos. While not explicitly forbidding cat consumption, its doctrine placed cats in a liminal space. Not sacred, not forbidden, but definitely suspicious. Often associated with heresy, sorcery, and sexual deviance, cats, particularly black ones, were demonized. This stigma rendered them morally expendable, a perception that, ironically, made them more likely to be eaten, even though they could only save lives. Still, cats served a functional role. They protected grain stores from rodents, a service especially valuable in urban centers and monasteries. In times of stability, they were tolerated or even respected for this role, but symbolism often trumped utility. As superstitions grew, particularly during the 13th and 14th centuries, the presence of a cat could incite suspicion or fear. Some towns even held public burnings of cats during religious festivals, a display of symbolic purification. Documentation of cat consumption is sparse and often indirect. Manuscripts, marginalia, and legal texts occasionally refer to small animals being consumed during famines. Artistic representations from illuminated text may show indistinct small carcasses prepared for the table, possibly feline. Direct references are rare, likely due to the shame surrounding the practice. Silence, in this case, is part of the history. One place where silence broke was during prolonged sieges in cities like Jerusalem, 1099, or Vienna, 1529. Residents consumed rats, leather, and domestic animals, including cats. These moments of desperation were recorded not with pride, but with a tone of necessity. The consumption of cat flesh became a marker of just how far human need could reach. Even so, the perception of cats was not universal. In southern Europe, particularly in Mediterranean regions, cats may have been more openly considered a protein source in dire times. Local traditions sometimes included dishes ambiguously labeled as wild meat or household game, where identities blurred under sauces and stews. The use of garlic, herbs, and wine in these regions helped to mask the strong flavor of cat meat. The lack of refrigeration and preservation options influenced preparation. Small animals like cats were eaten quickly after slaughter, often roasted whole or stewed with available root vegetables and herbs. Salt was precious, and fat even more so. These meals were not indulgent, they were utilitarian. What emerges from these fragments is not a tale of cruelty, but one of perseverance. The medieval world was governed by immediacy. There were no modern morals about animal companionship, no animal rights. Cats were creatures of duality, feared and useful, loved and expendable. To understand why medieval people ate cats, one must step outside modern assumptions and confront the raw mechanics of survival. This is not to romanticize the past, but to witness it fully. Every meal tells a story. Some stories are elegant, others are brutal, but all are human. Cats occupied a contradictory space in medieval European society. On one hand, they were valued for their utility, especially as defenders of grain stores against rats. On the other, they were enveloped in layers of superstition and fear. This dual perception contributed to the moral ambiguity surrounding their eventual consumption as food in times of crisis. Brought to Europe via trade routes from the East and North Africa, cats became common in early Christian communities. Monasteries and farms alike appreciated their usefulness in protecting precious food supplies. In these settings, the cat was more a working creature than a companion, tolerated for its effectiveness rather than loved for its personality. Yet as Christianity spread and absorbed or supplanted local pagan beliefs, the cultural image of the cat began to darken. Pagan traditions, such as those among Germanic or Celtic peoples, had revered the cat, often associating it with fertility goddesses like Freya. In the Christian worldview, these associations were recast as heretical or demonic. From the 12th century onward, black cats, in particular, were linked to witchcraft and evil. Possessing a cat could be interpreted as evidence of sorcery, and owning one became a risk. This transformation wasn't just theological, it had real, physical consequences. Public burnings of cats occurred in towns like Metz during religious festivals, a gruesome spectacle meant to symbolize the expulsion of sin. In these acts, cats were not seen as living creatures, but as extensions of darkness. This symbolic devaluation paved the way for practical devaluation. In moments of extreme scarcity, eating a cat became thinkable. This shift was more pronounced among the lower classes, who bore the brunt of famine and had limited access to conventional meats. While nobles dined on venison and pork, the poor scavenged and improvised. In secret, away from the judgment of neighbors or clergy, families might kill and cook a cat, disguising its identity as best they could. The meat might be called wild fare, or simply game, and prepared in a way that masked its origin. Medieval kitchens in towns and rural homes alike were utilitarian spaces. Large cauldrons were used to prepare communal meals, and open hearths provided constant fire for boiling or roasting. A cat, once cleaned and skinned, could be cut into small chunks and added to these stews, often alongside vegetables like leeks, onions, and turnips. Spices were rare among the poor, but herbs, such as sage or thyme, grown in small garden patches, might have been used to temper the dish's strong flavor. Visual records, though limited, provide glimpses into these culinary practices. Illustrated manuscripts like the Tarquinum Sanitatis sometimes depict indistinct small animals being prepared, their identities open to interpretation. The lack of explicit labeling suggests discretion or even denial. The shame of such meals lingered long after the hunger was gone. Cat meat did not circulate widely in marketplaces. Its consumption was a private act, whispered rather than declared. Still, indirect records exist. Legal complaints about cat thefts, for instance, hint at a black market value. In some regions, especially isolated ones, cultural practices may have included rituals to spiritually cleanse the act, prayers, songs, or blessings given before the killing, intended to appease divine or supernatural forces. The meat was not stored. It was consumed on the same day for fear of spoilage. Without refrigeration, and with only limited access to salting or drying methods, a small animal like a cat was eaten fresh. usually stewed to tenderize the tough, sinewy meat. The resulting dish was often shared among several people, portioned with old bread or stretched with broth. These practices reflected not just survival, but a recalibration of cultural values. Under duress, even animals once thought to harbor spirits or bring omens were reclassified as edible. This shift did not occur out of ignorance, but out of necessity. People knew what they were doing. They simply had no other choice. Today, with full bellies and domesticated views, we may recoil at such histories. But the story of cat consumption in the Middle Ages is not one of cruelty. It is one of pragmatism, of desperation, and of the human capacity to endure. The kitchen, however humble, becomes a mirror of hunger, of belief, and of survival. The act of preparing cat meat for human consumption in the Middle Ages required rudimentary skills and practical knowledge, often passed down by observation in modest households. Unlike the elaborate dishes of noble courts, which featured exotic spices and an abundance of meats, preparing a cat was done out of necessity, and typically in cramped, dimly lit environments with whatever tools were at hand. The process began with the capture. Without sophisticated traps, cats were usually lured with scraps or struck directly using rudimentary tools, wooden clubs, stones, or iron implements. These actions were carried out quietly, often before dawn, to avoid attention or the moral disapproval of others. Death was swift and done in secrecy, particularly in urban areas where such acts might be judged more harshly. Skinning the cat followed the basic method used for other small mammals like rabbits. A sharp knife would be used to make an incision along the belly, and the skin was peeled back carefully to preserve as much of the flesh as possible. The fur might be discarded, or in some cases repurposed for small household items. Internal organs were removed, though some, like the liver or heart, might be cooked separately if the family was especially hungry. Cat meat is lean and muscular, requiring slow cooking to become tender. Common methods included roasting directly over embers, stewing in cauldrons, or frying in shallow pans with animal fat. Fire was fueled by wood, oak, ash, or elm being preferred for their consistent burn. The smoke lent the food a rustic flavor, which was part of the everyday taste of peasant cooking. One of the more typical preparations was a simple stew. Chopped cat meat simmered slowly with water, coarse salt, leeks, onions, and, if fortune allowed, wild herbs such as sage. Root vegetables like turnips or parsnips were frequent additions, as they were hardy and grew well in poor soil. No wine or fermented additions were used. These were luxuries far beyond reach. The presentation was unimportant. Meals were served in ceramic bowls or on hard bread trenchers used as edible plates. The stew's flavor was strong and metallic but filling. For those eating it, satisfaction came not from taste, but from having something warm and solid in the stomach. In communal kitchens, such as those in monasteries or towns under siege, cat meat might be added anonymously to large cauldrons feeding many mouths. There, its identity could be easily obscured by volume and herbs. Vinegar or animal fats were sometimes used to lessen the gamey flavor, a practice informed more by oral tradition than by culinary science. Sanitation during preparation was minimal. Concepts of bacteria or contamination did not exist. Water used for rinsing the meat came from nearby wells or streams, and any purification, when practiced, was done with bitter herbs or prayer. In some households, spiritual rites preceded the meal, asking forgiveness or invoking protection. These customs, while not widespread, illustrate the lingering unease around eating cats. And the meat was never stored. Without refrigeration, spoilage was swift. Cats were eaten the same day they were killed. Salting used for larger cuts of meat, was not effective or economical for small animals. As such, cat consumption was always immediate and typically done in a single sitting. This culinary episode was not about indulgence or creativity. It was about necessity, about stretching meager supplies as far as possible. Every element of the dish spoke to a culture shaped by scarcity and hardship. The cook, usually a mother or elder, worked not with recipes but with instinct, memory, and hope. In these kitchens of struggle, each act of cooking was an act of defiance against hunger. Killing and boiling a cat was not a daily norm. It was an emergency solution, but it also embodied resilience. Those who prepared and ate such meals were not savage. They were survivors. The reconstruction of a medieval recipe using cat meat requires a careful and respectful approach to the past. This is not about encouraging contemporary practices, but about understanding with historical rigor the limits of culinary creativity under pressure. The goal is to narrate, based on plausible sources, how such a dish could have been prepared and what it represented. We begin in a rural setting at the end of the 13th century. A village on the outskirts of an abbey, stricken by a harsh winter and failed harvests. A peasant family of 6 must stretch their food resources to the limit. A single cat, caught the morning before, represents the only available source of protein for that day. The meat is washed in cold water and visually inspected. It is cut into smaller pieces, usually separated at natural joints. In an iron or clay cauldron, animal fat is melted over a medium wood fire. Onion, leek, and root vegetables are added and lightly sautéed. The meat is then placed in the pot and covered with water. Sage and salt are incorporated. The dish is simmered for hours, with water added as needed. When the broth thickens, crumbs of hard bread are added to give it consistency. The result is a thick, earthy soup with a strong flavor. This recipe reflects what would have been plausible in a peasant kitchen. Few ingredients, long cooking times to tenderize tough meat, and total use of leftovers. It was common to reuse this stew for 2 or 3 days, reheating it and adjusting its consistency with more bread or water. Narrating a recipe like this is, above all, an exercise in historical empathy. It is not about exalting the practice, but about understanding the human desperation that led to it. Hunger is a powerful force. It subverts norms, redefines boundaries, and transforms taboos into necessities. Cat meat, in the light of medieval culture, symbolizes the convergence of superstition, survival, and adaptation. It stood on the threshold between the sacred and the profane, between domestic companion and emergency resource. Preparing it was an act of silent transgression, but also one of struggle. This narrative study allows us to glimpse not only the gestures of a forgotten kitchen, but also the voices of those who, faced with imminent death, chose to keep living. In the silence of villages and stone kitchens, in the shadows of a difficult time, the cat transformed into broth speaks to us of a Europe marked by deprivation and resilience. Today, when we recall these practices, we should not laugh or judge, but understand. The history of food is also the history of humanity, and in it, even the darkest dishes have something to teach.